The last time my mother said it, she did it in front of my sister, my brother-in-law, and the lawyer they'd brought into my kitchen like a man carrying a shovel to someone else's grave. "Don't act wounded now, Harold," she said, not even looking at me when she pushed the papers across the table. "You were never really mine." I was 72 years old, standing in the house I had repaired with my own hands for 40 years, and somehow those 6 words still landed with the force they had when I was 8. My sister Diane lowered her eyes, not out of shame but to hide satisfaction. Her husband Brent leaned back in my father's chair as if he had owned it for years. The lawyer cleared his throat and said the documents were only for property management purposes, which is a phrase people use when they hope age has made you soft. I did not sign. I folded my glasses, laid them on the table, and said, "Then you can all leave." They thought that was the old man's version of a tantrum. They thought they still had time. That was their first mistake. I have always been the quiet one in my family, which people often confuse with being weak. I was a surveyor most of my life. Land teaches you patience. It teaches you that lines matter, that people lie, that paper outlasts memory, and that the truth is usually sitting somewhere in a drawer while everyone argues in circles. My father, Walter Stone, used to say that if you wanted to know what a family really loved, you should watch what changed after a funeral. After his, everything changed. I was 19 when Walter's heart gave out in the barn. I gave up a state college scholarship and stayed. My mother, Lenora, said she couldn't manage the house and the bills without me. Diane was still in junior high then, all ribbons and soft cheeks and easy tears. I worked days, studied nights when I could, and by the time I was 25 I had become the kind of man people call dependable when what they really mean is useful. I paid off the machinery debt. I kept the roof from collapsing after the storm of '83. I replaced pipes, rewired half the first floor, sold 2 acres by the creek when my mother's medical bills got too high, and somehow never complained loudly enough to make it memorable. I married once late. My wife, Carol, lasted 11 good years before cancer took her. We never had children of our own, though my niece Heather's little girl, Evie, adopted me in the informal, holy way children sometimes do. When she was small, she called me Grandpa Hal, and I let her keep doing it because it warmed an empty part of the house. Diane, on the other hand, learned early that softness opened doors. She married Brent Kessler, a man with glossy shoes, hard teeth, and the kind of confidence that depends entirely on other people doubting themselves. Brent never built anything. He arranged things. He leveraged things. He once described my father's land as dead equity, which is how I knew he had no soul for soil. To him, the house was square footage. To me, it still held my father's pipe tobacco in the cedar closet when the weather turned damp. The cruel little sentence my mother used on me, "never really mine," had followed me my whole life like a draft under a closed door. The first time she said it, I was 8 and had broken a jam jar in the pantry. She grabbed my wrist too hard and hissed, "You should be grateful I took you in." At 12, when I asked why Diane had baby pictures in the hall and I didn't, she said, "Because some children belong and some are raised." At 16, after a fight over borrowing Walter's truck, she said, "You're lucky Walter kept you at all." I asked Walter about it once. He was patching harness leather on the porch. He stared at the yard for a long moment and said, "Your mother has a mean way of handling fear." Then he put a hand on my shoulder and added, "You're my son." That's enough for me. When a man is young, he will build a whole identity around one kind sentence if it saves him from a harsher truth. I did exactly that. I never pressed for more. I assumed there had been some shame in my beginnings, an adoption, a cousin's child taken in, some arrangement from before I could remember. My mother had a lockbox where she kept birth certificates, deeds, war bonds, and funeral cards. She never let me near it. I learned not to ask. After my mother fell and cracked her hip at 91, Diane took over her appointments and medicine lists. Brent appeared more often, carrying groceries he charged to my mother's account and speaking in that false helpful tone men use when they are measuring your furniture in their minds. They began referring to the house as if it were already part of an estate. "When we update things, when the property transfers, when this place is sold." I still lived there, in the downstairs room I had moved into after my knee surgery. I still paid the taxes because Mom gets confused by county mail. I still covered the furnace repairs and the insurance premiums when Diane said cash was tight. But slowly, the language around me changed. I was no longer Harold, the man who had kept the house alive. I was Harold, the elderly occupant. The temporary one. The first paper Brent put in front of me was a limited power of attorney, or that's what he called it. Just in case something happens, he said. Makes things simpler. For whom? I asked. He smiled. For the family. That word sounded crowded in his mouth. I took the papers to an attorney in town named Miriam Vale, a careful woman with silver hair and the expression of someone who disliked being lied to recreationally. She read them once, then a second time, slower. This doesn't simplify anything, she said. It gives your sister authority over occupancy decisions, maintenance accounts, and eventual sale negotiations. Did your mother ask for this herself? My mother says a great many things herself, I told her. I told her what I thought I knew. Walter bought the place. Or maybe his father had. Then some acreage passed around. Families tell land stories the way drunks tell directions, confidently and wrong. She asked for copies of the deed, tax history, and probate filings after Walter died. I said I'd bring what I could find. That search, more than anything, cracked the lie open. My fingers shook hard enough that I had to sit down before I opened it. The letter was brief. Walter had written that if I ever had cause to doubt myself, I was to ask for the Mercer documents, not the stone ones. He said the house on Briar Lane had originally belonged to Samuel Mercer, Lenora's first husband, who died before I turned one. He wrote that the property had passed into a trust under Samuel's mother until their son, Harold Mercer, reaches lawful majority. Their son. Not ward. Not orphan taken in. Their son. At the bottom he had written, in his plain blocky hand, "If this letter is in your hands, your mother has kept the truth too long." I read it 3 times and felt every one of my years. That evening I drove to the county records office with the kind of calm that only comes after a man has been hurt so deeply he can no longer feel the first wave of it. The clerk, a patient woman named Tasha, helped me search archived indexes. The original birth certificate had been amended in 1958 when Walter legally adopted me after marrying my mother. But the earlier record was still traceable by seal reference. Maternal name, Lenora Mercer. Paternal name, Samuel Mercer. I sat in that fluorescent room staring at the document until the numbers blurred. My mother had not taken me in. She had given birth to me. I had been the legitimate son of the man whose family once owned the house. And for reasons I did not yet understand, she had spent most of my life telling me I was lucky to be tolerated. When I showed Miriam the letter and the abstract, her eyebrows rose just slightly. This, she said, is not family mythology anymore. The Mercer trust language took 2 more days to untangle. Samuel's mother had created a life estate for Lenora, but the remainder interest, the actual ownership after Lenora's occupancy rights ended, was designated to the natural-born issue of Samuel Mercer. If no such issue existed, the property would pass to Samuel's nearest collateral heirs. Diane, being Walter's daughter and not Samuel's, had no claim through that chain at all. Unless I had died without descendants and without asserting ownership, Brent and Diane had been circling a house that was never truly theirs to sell. That should have been enough. It almost never is. The thing that turned proof into a blade came from Evie. She was 26 by then, living in Columbus and working for a marketing firm that seemed to require young people to answer emails at midnight. She called one Sunday, cheerful at first, then suddenly hesitant. "Grandpa Hal," she said, "I did one of those DNA kits last month. You know, for fun. Family origins and all that. I only called because something weird happened. A woman messaged me through the match list. Her name's Clara Baines. She says we might be related through Lenora's side. My mother had no sisters still living, or so I believed. No cousins we ever saw. Lenora had treated her own past like a house she'd set fire to and walked away from." "No," I said. "I think I'd like you to answer." Clara turned out to be the daughter of my mother's younger sister, Ruth, who had moved to Oregon in 1961 after what family gossip once called a falling out. Clara had photographs. In one, my mother was standing on a porch holding a baby in a knitted cap. On the back, in Ruth's handwriting, were the words, "Lenora with little Harold, spring of '54. Another was of a hospital room, my mother in bed, Walter nowhere in sight because Walter had not yet married her. Then Clara sent scans of 2 letters Ruth had saved. In one, Ruth begged Lenora not to punish the boy for Samuel's death. In the other, dated years later, Ruth wrote, "I know why you keep telling Harold he isn't yours. If he ever learns he is Samuel's boy, the Mercer house can't be steered to Diane. But lies told to children do not stay children-sized." I have read legal records with less force than that sentence. Diane and Brent chose that week to become bolder. They arrived on a Tuesday with a locksmith, claiming my mother had decided it was unsafe for me to remain in the main house because of my balance. Brent said they had found me confused in the yard, which was a neat trick, since I had spent that morning replacing a downspout while he was still driving in from town. "This is temporary," Diane said, hovering by the doorway in a cream coat too delicate for actual work. "We found you a nice place near assisted living. Mom needs calm right now." "My mother needs honesty," I said. Brent stepped closer. "Let's not make this ugly." Men like Brent always say that right before they become ugly on purpose. The sheriff's deputy, who came out, knew me. He also knew paperwork. Brent waved a copy of my mother's medical power of attorney as if it controlled walls and door frames. Miriam, thank God, had already warned me such things are often confused deliberately. I showed the deputy proof I resided there and receipts for utilities in my name. He advised everyone to stand down until ownership and occupancy were clarified. Diane burst into tears so fast it almost deserved applause. That night, from the hallway outside my mother's bedroom, I heard her say in a flat, tired voice, "He should have gone quietly." It is a difficult thing to learn, late in life, that your greatest wound was not accidental. My mother had not lashed out in moments of temper. She had maintained a narrative. She had shaped me with it. Every time I deferred, every time I swallowed an insult, every time I treated the house as something borrowed rather than partly mine by right, her lie had done its work. I did not confront her then. Rage is noisy. Paper is not. Miriam filed a petition seeking declaratory relief on the trust and an injunction against any transfer, encumbrance, or forced removal. We attached the amended and original birth records, Walter's letter, the Mercer abstract, Ruth's correspondence, and the DNA kinship summary Clara provided. Brent's attorney, because of course Brent had one ready, called the DNA an emotional distraction. Miriam replied by requesting sworn discovery on every estate-related move Brent and Diane had made in the previous 18 months. That was when the money surfaced. Diane had been using my mother's accounts not just to buy groceries and medications, but to make consulting payments to a shell LLC Brent had formed the year before. There were transfers labeled home management fees, senior relocation planning, maintenance oversight. Thousands of dollars siphoned from an old woman's funds while they told me the taxes were becoming impossible. When Miriam showed me the bank records, I sat very still. Did my mother know? She signed some authorizations, Miriam said carefully. Whether she understood the scale is another question. The hearing was set for late October in probate court, but the final confrontation began a week earlier, in the one place my family had always believed gave them advantage, the dining room. Diane insisted we all meet privately, for dignity. What she meant was that she hoped emotion might do what law could not. My mother was brought in wearing a blue cardigan, thin as paper, her face still sharp in the old familiar way. Brent had arranged the chairs as if staging a negotiation over a business merger. I brought Miriam. Brent looked irritated immediately. This was supposed to be family. Miriam smiled faintly. Then perhaps you should have behaved like one. My mother's eyes settled on me. There was no softness in them, but there was something new. Fatigue, perhaps. Or the dawning understanding that I had finally come with my own lantern. I laid the photographs on the table first. The porch. The hospital bed. My name in Ruth's hand. Then Walter's letter. Then the certified birth record. Then the bank transfers. Diane stared at the papers as if they might rearrange themselves if she refused to blink. Brent recovered first. None of this changes Lenora's wishes. No, I said. It only exposes yours. My mother reached for Walter's letter, and her fingers trembled against the page. For the first time in my life, I saw her not as commanding or cruel, but as cornered by a truth she had fed on too long to digest. Her jaw worked before the words came. Because once Samuel died, everything in that house still belonged to his name. His mother made sure of that. I was 23, widowed, broke, and watched. Walter offered me stability, but he was not going to raise another man's heir and then hand his own daughter nothing. Walter's letter sat between us like a witness. He knew, I said. Yes, she said, and the words sounded like defeat. He knew. And he hated it. Then he loved you anyway, which made it worse. Diane looked from her to me, pale now. Mom, what are you saying? My mother turned to her daughter with an exhaustion I almost pitied. I'm saying the house was never yours to count on. I told you what kept this family from splitting in half when there was still something to save, my mother snapped, and for a moment I heard the younger Lenora, the one who weaponized fear because she never learned any cleaner instrument. Miriam slid the bank records forward. And the consulting fees? Was that also an act of preservation? Brent began talking then, too fast, arguing reimbursements, management burdens, verbal permissions. Nobody listened. Diane started crying again, but now it was not performance. It was the sound of an adult discovering she had built her future on theft wrapped in sentiment. Diane and Brent lost more than the house. They lost the confident language of entitlement. They lost access to the funds they had already half spent in their minds. Brent, I later learned, also lost whatever reputation he still had at the bank after questions arose about his consulting company. Diane stopped calling me entirely. It was quieter that way. My mother lived another 8 months. I visited her in assisted living once a week, not out of saintliness, but because I had reached an age where bitterness feels too much like letting the wrong people continue to occupy your home. Some days she spoke plainly. Some days she acted as if nothing important had happened. Once, near the end, when the light was thinning across her blanket, she said, I told myself I was hardening you. I looked at her for a long moment. No, I said. You were reducing me. There's a difference. She nodded without argument. That was the closest thing to apology we ever managed. After she passed, I stood alone in the house on Briar Lane and listened to the silence settle correctly for the first time in years. I kept the place. I put the title in proper order. I restored Samuel Mercer's name in the family records and kept Walter Stone's photograph on the mantle because love counts too, even when law does not. I set aside enough money from the recovered accounts to endow a small scholarship at the county trade school for students who stay behind to help their families and deserve better than being used for it. As for Evie, I made sure she knew the full history, not the softened version families tell children so they won't ask intelligent questions later. She came down one weekend with paint swatches and coffee and helped me air out the upstairs rooms. At one point she touched the banister and said, "So this was yours all along." I thought about that for a while before I answered. No, I said. Not mine. Mine to protect. That is what age has taught me in the end. A house is wood, land, paper, and weather. But dignity is something else. It is the moment you stop borrowing your own life from people who lied to you about your right to live it. My mother tried to make me feel like an accident she had reluctantly carried. My sister tried to make me feel like a relic she could step around. Brent tried to make me feel like a confused old man standing in the way of progress. They were wrong on every count. I was the son. I was the witness. I was the man who stayed long enough to learn where the truth had been hidden. And when it finally came to light, it did not roar. It simply stood there, undeniable, wearing my name.